Chapter 7. Early in the fall of 1927, we went to visit my uncle Bishop Mike's in Hungary. We always loved the vacations which we spent in the sunny white house at Repce St. Georgi, filled for me with happy childhood memories. The bishop and my husband became devoted friends. They were similar and united in tastes, both filled with the same deep love of life and its beauty, the same delightful sense of humour, the same strong feeling of duty toward their station in life. Both of these men were inspired with the determination to dedicate their lives to the fight for the ideal good. Another strong bond was their love, each for his own king. The bishop never tired of telling us the details of Emperor Karl's unexpected visit to Szombathely in 1921. This was the diocesan seat 30 miles from Repce St. Georgi. It was late on the eve of Easter, and in celebration of the great feast Bishop Mike's was entertaining with a dinner for distinguished guests. A serving man came to the bishop and whispered, "There are 2 men in the lower hall wishing to speak to your excellency." "Who are they?" the bishop asked, wondering who would be calling at so late an hour. They did not give names. The elder is short and stocky and looks familiar. The younger is tall and wears dark glasses. The bishop left his guests to meet the 2 late visitors. He recognized at once Count Tamas Aidodi, who rushed up the steps to meet him. "Tamas, what brings you here at so late an hour?" "Don't think that you can stay the night," my uncle warned jokingly. "My house is already filled to overflowing with guests. But whom have you brought with you?" He cast an inquiring glance at the tall stranger. "Do you not recognize me, Your Excellency?" the stranger asked. "I have heard the voice, though at the moment I cannot place it." The man removed his hat and then his dark glasses, revealing his fine dark eyes. The bishop drew back in astonishment. "Majestat!" It was the King Emperor of the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary who threw himself into my uncle's arms. Alone, Emperor Karl had made the perilous journey from his place of exile at Pronja in Switzerland. With the passport of a Portuguese gardener in his pocket and in peasant clothes, he had escaped the Pronja guards. On March 25th, he had travelled to Vienna in a 3rd-class carriage. Good Friday night, he had knocked on the door of Count Tamas Aidodi, his old and well-loved friend. Count Aidodi had used every persuasion to try to convince Emperor Karl that it was best for him to return at once to Switzerland. He learned from the king that this venture had been planned by Empress Zita and her brother Sixtus of Parma, backed only by vague verbal promises from Briand of France that a restoration would be recognized once it had been accomplished. There was no organization within Hungary to back this mad plan, not even any knowledge among monarchists that the king contemplated such a move to regain his throne. Somewhere the plan had miscarried, but the king reminded Count Aidodi that Regent Horthy was only holding the reins of government for the crown, in readiness for the king's return, and his intentions were to go himself to see Horthy. Emperor Karl inquired about the generals, whom he had counted on to support him. Count Aidodi gave him a tragic picture of a country ravaged by bloodshed and terror, old friends and soldiers working as labourers, dishwashers, anything to keep themselves alive. Count Aidodi, as well as every local monarchist, felt that in time the King Emperor would be called back to his country. But the time was not ripe. This effort to force the issue was ill-timed and premature. It would probably ruin forever any hope that the emperor might regain his throne. Count Aidodi told the king that even the monarchist party was split into 2 factions, and that this coup d'etat was a hazardous and foolhardy thing. But his love for the emperor in the end outweighed his better judgment, and Thomas Idode not only arranged for this Portuguese peasant to pass over the border into Hungary, but accompanied him on the trip. After a perilous and wearying journey, they had at last arrived in Szombathely. Unfortunately, at my uncle's palace that night was Joseph Vass, the Minister of Welfare in Regent Horthy's cabinet. How Vass would meet the king worried my uncle as he made his way back to the banquet room. When they entered, the guests rose to their feet. Some of them were sure that they were seeing a ghost. Bishop Mike sent for Albin Lingauer, who was a strong legitimist, and he also sent a message to bring Anton Liha, who was in command of the garrison. Fortunately, the troops in Szombathely, as well as the people, were strongly monarchist, and there was no immediate danger for the emperor. But his faithful friends, my uncle Bishop Mike's among them, were doubtful about the success of the surprise visit. Another uncle of mine, Prime Minister Count Paul Teleke, was visiting near Szombathely at the hunting estate of Count Anton Zigre. These two men were also called for a conference. Count Teleke implored the king to give up his plan to see Horthy in Budapest. This move would, he warned him, give the little Entente the excuse for which they had been waiting, to take over the entire territory of Hungary. It would mean bloodshed, and even if Horthy was in sympathy with the king, his first duty would be to safeguard the welfare of the nation. While all of these men were forming a council to decide on some plan of action, Colonel Liha arrived with his Magyarian soldiers as an honour guard for the king. No decision had been made when the sun rose, and the king went out into the courtyard to receive the allegiance of the garrison. Colonel Liha and his men were eager to escort the king to Budapest, but Emperor Karl would not hear of it. He even forbade Tamás Idode to accompany him. His plan was to confront Horthy alone and demand that the government be turned over to him. The visit to Horthy was a tragic farce, a bitter and humiliating experience, and after hours of useless talk, the king returned to Szombathely. He had not slept in 2 days. No one had thought of offering him food. Everyone was too keyed up to think of so trivial a thing. It was like having a time bomb in their midst, not knowing at what moment it might explode, not knowing who would be destroyed by it. The king was a sick and broken man. For many months he had been suffering from fits of coughing, his face flushed and his eyes unhealthily bright. Now that the ordeal was over, this malady struck him down. It was morning again before he reached Szombathely. My uncle had received by telephone the news of the humiliating interview with Horthy. He was instructed to hold the king in custody and was made responsible for his safety. The government was, in the meantime, trying to persuade Switzerland to permit the king to return to Prangin. Bishop Mike said that it was Tamás Idode, unashamed of his tears, who met the king, by this time so weak that he almost fell into the count's arms. My uncle's own doctor was called, and they were told that the king was a very sick man, too ill to be moved. For days he lay in a burning delirium. When it became known that the king was in the bishop's palace in Szombathely, people poured into the town from all directions. Crowds gathered outside the palace, and from his room the king could hear their voices raised in singing the Hungarian national song. Unshaken to thy homeland, be loyal, O Magyar. It is thy cradle, it is thy grave. A special train was brought into the town, and the people found that the king was again being sent into exile. The crowds grew greater, the cries louder. Hail to our king! Remain with us! Hail to our king! The king went to the balcony and waved, looking down on what my uncle described as a scene of colourful splendour. In the courtyard below were the soldiers of the garrison and crowds of his loyal magnate subjects. In the foreground, the Counts of Idodi and other representatives of the Magyarian nobility. All of them were dressed in the traditional magnate's costume. These were embroidered with gold, fur edged their swirling capes, and on their heads were shakos blazing with jewels. Their swords were held in salute to the king. Magyars would rally to his cause. It was not too late to march on Budapest. But even Bishop Mikes, who stood at the king's side, told him that it would mean bloodshed. It was now or never. The king could not bring himself to return to the throne over the corpses of his well-loved friends or his loyal Magyar people. For the king, this demonstration was a rare moment of triumph, a memory which he would carry away with him into his second exile. We stayed, Enoch and I, in the very rooms where Emperor Karl had stayed during his tragic visit. On our first trip to Szombathely after this event, my uncle showed us the window where the king had taken his last sad farewell of his people. Here I stood, he told us, following with my eyes my departing king, knowing that a great and dear hope was forever shattered. The king-emperor went back to his pathetic exile, to a life filled with suffering and disappointment, which ended in a small villa on top of a mountain at Funchal on the island of Madeira. The house, high above Funchal, was wrapped in fog during all the winter months. This climate greatly aggravated the king's chest condition. Death came on the first day of April 1922. Karl of Habsburg, king-emperor, died at the age of 34. Years later, Bishop Mikes took me to Funchal, where we visited the death room of the king, and I saw tears in the eyes of my uncle as we walked silently through the desolate place. We visited the nearby church where the king-emperor was buried and saw the gifts of flowers placed there by the peasants of Madeira who came to kneel at the lonely grave. We stayed with my uncle in his Szombathely residence for a celebration which took place in his beautiful Louis XVI cathedral. He had, with much care and discrimination, redecorated the palace and also the cathedral, collecting for them many fine and historical pieces of art. His house in Szombathely was considered to be an outstanding monument of art. On the morning of the celebration, I saw my uncle in his robes of state for the first time. He was full of dignity and most impressive, an ermine cape worn over his purple mantle. Although the diocesan palace at Szombathely was quite close to the cathedral, it was the custom for him to arrive on such occasions in a state coach, drawn by 4 white horses. He entered the great front door, passing down the aisle, blessing the kneeling people. His steps were light and swift, his face intense and loving. We listened to the voices of the choir and the deep-throated organ which filled the vast church as the bishop offered the Mass and then ascended the steps to the pulpit. It seemed to me that he spoke of love of God and the sweetness of sacrifice. I was deeply moved by his words, although I scarcely understood Hungarian. It must have been the intensity of his spiritual fire which affected me. After the celebration in Szombathely, we accompanied the bishop to his country home, where he enjoyed a few days of leisure with us. He and Enoch had many of their long discussions about politics and other mutual interests. Enoch was happy to be given permission to hunt to his heart's content in the extensive hunting preserve which belonged to the estate. Our hunting days in Hungary are dear memories, tramping through the woods, breathing the sweet muddy smell of fallen leaves. From far off we would hear the bugling of the stag as we walked hand in hand through the world of golden leaves. While we were the guests of my uncle, we were invited for small game hunting to the castle of Count and Countess Sándor Idodi. In the fall, It was the custom for the entire neighbourhood to meet frequently for hunting and a gay social life. We roamed all day through the woods and fields. Then, with the coming of evening, we would return to the castle, where rows of hundreds of pheasants and rabbits were laid out in the courtyard for all to see. The gamekeepers in their Hungarian national costumes would blow the hunting horn. The day's hunt was ended. But now there would be a festive evening in the candle-lit rooms of the old castle, the men in tailcoats and the ladies in formal evening gowns. During the banquet each night, we were entertained by the playing of gypsy music, while the men servants were busy pouring the strong, sweet native wines. There was more gypsy music after dinner, and on the last night, a ball ending at dawn with the Hungarian dance, the csadas. Whenever I heard this wild, sweet music, I knew that a part of me belonged to Hungary. After the hunting came St. Imre's Day in Budapest. The city lay about 200 miles east of Repszent-Györgyi. We drove to Budapest through the wide sunny land, the sun-baked Hortobodge, the Great Plain. Far in every direction stretched the rolling Puszta, the cattle land and the fields of corn and wheat, which were the shining gold of the Danube Valley. We passed villages of chalk-white houses with thatched roofs and gardens filled with golden-starred sunflowers. Along the roads, bordered with poplar and acacia trees, white, wide-horned Hungarian oxen moved with classical dignity, drawing their ancient carts. The country was wide, endlessly wide and peaceful. All Budapest was celebrating. As we drove into the evening sky was filled with stars, like reflections in a dark pool of the thousands of lights of the great city. A procession of boats moved majestically along on the quiet surface of the Danube. The first boat carried the Blessed Sacrament in a huge monstrance, circled with a halo of burning lights. Cardinals, bishops and priests knelt reverently on the deck. The boats which followed were crowded with high officials and important people in their old and colourful Magyar costumes, splendid with gold braid and fur. The capes of the men were thrown over one shoulder, and on their feet they wore high shining boots. The pageant floated past in deep silence. Then the Te Deum burst gloriously on the night air. Thousands of voices from the river's bank took up the paean of praise. It was an experience never to be forgotten. The next morning a field mass was said on the outskirts of Budapest. Thousands of peasants came from all over the countryside in their brilliant native costumes, kneeling in profound piety side by side with the people of the city. I think happily of the procession on the Danube, of the mighty Te Deum that rose from the people, the deep devotion of the crowds at that morning field mass, a centuries-old tradition, faith for all the world to see. St. Imre's Day was an expression of the deep spirituality that filled the hearts of the Hungarian people. Beloved, pious Hungary, what has become of you today? It seems unbelievable that these same people could surrender to both the evil forces of Hitler and Stalin. I remember the old lament of the Magyars. All that is evil comes from Russia.